All right, so good morning, everyone. I know I'm between you and coffee, so I'll try and keep you awake at least until the break. So again, my name is Frank Lee, and as Joe mentioned, at the time of this work, I was a PhD student at Berkeley. I've since finished and joined as visiting researcher at Facebook for actually the year, so I'll be starting at Georgia Tech next fall. So today I'm going to talk about some work that was done with some really awesome collaborators, shown up here. And it looks at how system administrators manage software updates, particularly from a security context. So every year, we find thousands and thousands of new security vulnerabilities. And software updates with their security patches are one of the main ways, if not really the main way, that we combat these security concerns. But as many of you are probably well aware, software updates have not been quite the solution that we would like them to be. And this is in large part due to many of the human elements at play during the updating process, as kind of poked fun of here in this XKCD comic. But in a more serious note, the consequences of poor updating behavior or of delayed updates can be quite severe, especially for system administrators who are not just managing personal devices, but they're managing the security of many machines on behalf of organizations. And security lapses or security holes at those machines, at those organizations, can result in severe security incidences or breaches, such as has been reported with Equifax, Nationwide Insurance, and many, many other organizations. So it's really vital that we understand how administrators go about managing software updates and explore ways to potentially improve their operations. So there has been some prior work that's looked at the update process, particularly focused on end users. And I put a few works up here that have actually been all done relatively recently, all just within the last 5 years. And they've really helped map out what end user updating looks like. But end users are not the only population that we should care about. System administrators are this incredibly important yet distinct population. And they're distinct because they're not only more technically sophisticated and experienced than the average end user, but they do have this expanded responsibility of really managing the security of these organizations. Now, there's been some work that's looked at various aspects of administrator operations, just like the previous talk. But to date, there's been nothing that's done up-to-date systematic evaluation of their update process specifically. And that's really what motivated this particular study. So in this work, we tried to shed light on two main research questions. The first being what this update process looks like for the administrators. And the second is to try and understand some of the consequences or impact of their actions and decisions, particularly from a security perspective. So to answer these questions, we did a multi-part user study. And here I'm just going to go over the methodology at a really high level, and the details are all in the paper. We started with a pilot interview that basically allowed us to try and understand what the major components or aspects of the updating process were. And we used that to guide the design of a much more in-depth and larger scale online survey and semi-structured interview to kind of drill into those topics. So we recruited via a variety of channels, including the Reddit subthread that was mentioned in the previous talk. But I wanted to bring up that my co-author, Lisa, actually went to this conference called Lisa, which is actually a USENIX conference for administrators. So that was awesome. So we recruited administrators who were adult US residents who had been at the organization for at least a year so that they had settled into their jobs there and were familiar with that environment, and that they had at least 5 employees at that organization so that we had some limit, at least some lower bound on kind of scale of these organizations. The paper has a demographic breakdown of both the participants and the organizations they worked for. I'll just briefly mention that they actually largely matched the previous study. And to analyze the responses, we used inductive thematic analysis with multiple coders on our team. But again, the details are all in the paper. So what did we find through this process, or through this work? So we found that the update process really proceeded through several different stages, which I've put up here. Now, as you look at these stages, they probably seem fairly intuitive or fairly expected. And in fact, we find that these main stages do correspond with the main stages of end user updating as found in prior work. And that's not too surprising because ultimately administrators and end users are using the same sorts of software mechanisms to initiate these updates. But what we find is very different is once you look at each of these different stages and look at the various considerations, actions, and behaviors within each stage, we see a lot of differences between end users and administrators. And in the paper, we have a more explicit comparison between the two population groups, but I'm not going to talk too much about it today. Instead, today I'm just going to briefly go through these different stages and just highlight one or two salient considerations. And I'm actually going to focus not on all of the stages, but rather the latter 3 stages, and I'm just going to really briefly go through the first 2 stages. So this entire update process starts when administrators learn that an update is available. And our administrators spoke about how they were very proactive about searching about update information and about available updates. And this is actually in contrast to end users, which prior work found was typically more passive or much more reactive. Administrators also spoke about how update information was often spread out amongst a lot of different sources and a lot of different channels, and many of them mentioned that information retrieval about updates could be quite challenging. But once they did learn about an update, they then needed to decide if they were going to apply the update or not. And in the paper, we list a bunch of factors that they discussed weighing when deciding if they were going to apply the update. I'm just going to highlight one, which is that they spoke of prioritizing different types of updates, such as security updates versus feature or performance updates, and so on. And overall, administrators did seem to universally prioritize security and critical bug fixes, and other types of updates were more of a mixed message or mixed bag there. But once the administrators have decided to apply the update, they now need to prepare for its installation. So they discussed several different steps that they took in preparation. One of them was to make backups or snapshots in case something goes wrong. Another was to prepare these hosts, particularly their configurations and dependencies. And I'm not actually going to focus too much more on these now because they're going to come up later on in the talk. And we're going to focus on the third main preparatory step that they took, which was testing updates. And administrators spoke of testing updates because they wanted to understand what the impact of the updates were, and they wanted to understand if there were any potential problems that might arise from the update. And they were worried enough about this that testing was really widespread. In fact, only 10% of those in our survey did not bother testing, and none of our interview subjects did. All of our interview subjects said that they tested. In terms of the testing strategy, there were 2 main overarching strategies. The first was what we call dedicated test environment, where you have a test server or even a test team to help evaluate the impact of the update. And if you didn't want to have this dedicated resource, or even if you did, the most popular strategy was actually something that we called staggered deployment, where the update was actually slowly rolled out in stages across the company's machines or the organization's machines. So to kind of illustrate this, imagine you're part of an organization with many, many different hosts, and you segment them or group them into different stages, such as a bunch of machines for administrators, some machines for developers, and then the all-important production machines that are perhaps supporting your organization or its product or service. So with staggered deployment, what you do is you roll out in stages where perhaps you start with the least important or the lowest priority machines, such as the administrator machines. You update them and wait to see if anything happens. And if nothing happens, or nothing bad happens, I should say, then you update the developer machines, wait a little bit, see if anything bad happens. And if not, then you finally roll out to the production machines, hoping that nothing bad happens. Now, this seems like a very sensible way of dealing with the rollout, kind of mitigating impact of bad updates. But there's a really interesting consequence to this strategy that's actually highlighted by a couple quotes from our participants. So in the blue speech bubble, one participant spoke of patching dev and test servers first, waiting a few weeks, and then patching production. And in the green speech bubble, we have someone talking about patching the non-important machines first, waiting, or so-called letting them bake for a month, and then moving on to the important machines. And what's really important about these quotes, or what's really interesting about these quotes, is the time aspect here, the temporal aspect, where administrators are talking about this staggered deployment rollout that's taking on the orders of weeks to months to actually roll out completely. And what's kind of unfortunate, or very unfortunate, is that the last group that's typically updated are these all-important production machines, or these very valuable machines that are oftentimes the most vulnerable or exposed machines, especially if they're supporting some sort of internet service or internet-facing product. So here, administrators are making this trade-off between kind of hedging against bad updates or update problems, or favoring that instead of favoring like prompt, expedient updates that could be solving security problems. So ultimately, when it came to preparation, while I mentioned several steps, testing was one of the major steps that was widely done. But the way that administrators were doing this testing process could often delay updates quite significantly. Now, once they had done this preparation, then they went about deploying the updates. And I'll briefly mention that the staggered deployment model that I just mentioned is this combination hybrid testing and deployment process kind of merged together. But when we asked administrators how they actually deployed the updates at scale across many machines, the most common way was to use these third-party managers, such as Ansible or Chef, which really helped kind of automate or at least scale up this process. But these third-party managers were often not complete solutions in themselves, and administrators spoke extensively of using custom scripts and programs to really cater the update deployment to exactly fit their particular environment. Now, you might be also wondering at this point, why not just use automatic updates and that solves just everything? And administrators did talk about using automatic updates quite extensively for at least some of their software. But not all software packages offer automatic updates. And administrators spoke extensively about how many times they would still need to do manual actions to actually get updates rolled out. And they spoke of a lot of the challenges that arose in automation. So while automation was very important and very valued by the administrators, administrators did talk about how it was very challenging to actually get right. One of the challenges was simply implementing this, both the time and effort-wise, in organizations to really fit their particular environment. But they also talked about how automated solutions or getting automation working correctly when it came to managing configurations and dependencies could be really quite challenging. And these are dependencies both upstream and downstream. Also, administrators are really managing a variety of different hosts, many hosts with different platforms, different software, and different software versions. So handling this host heterogeneity was also quite challenging in an automated fashion. And then another very significant challenge when it came to automation was disruptions or unexpected disruptions. And this arose in many forms, including unexpected system restarts or software restarts, as well as just unexpected changes that would arise from an update that was automatically pushed out. And in the paper, we talk a lot more about just the the concerns about these disruptions and timing concerns with rolling out updates in general. So ultimately, administrators did figure out ways to deploy their updates across their machines, but often it was an ad hoc strategy. And overall deployment, particularly automating it, was quite difficult. So hopefully at this point, once you finish deploying the update, everything is good, your patch is out or your updates are out, and you're done. But unfortunately, the story often doesn't end there, and sometimes some issues arise due to these updates. And in fact, 98% of those in our survey said that they had recently dealt with a buggy update. Now, this number might not actually be exactly accurate because it is a recollection, but it at least reflects the general sentiments or the general mentality of our administrators. So this is one of the primary reasons that was driving a lot of the testing that I mentioned earlier, but it could also drive really extreme updating behavior. For example, we have one participant talking about how they actually just stopped updating production machines because it was causing too many issues. And from a security standpoint, that's probably not good. So to handle some of these buggy updates, most people spoke of rolling back to a snapshot or reverting the update. And only 5 to 15% said that they tried to work out the update issue while leaving the update in place. And this is another case where we're seeing this trade-off between functionality, where people are rolling back to a functional state, and security, because ultimately, if the software update involves a security fix, they're rolling back to a functional state, but they're rolling back to an insecure state. And they'd rather have that rather than having a secure state where they're trying to mitigate the problems introduced by the update. So ultimately, administrators did face buggy issues, or they felt that they would frequently face buggy issues. And when they did, they typically reverted or undid the update and went back to this functional but ultimately vulnerable state. But once they did handle these post-update issues, this life cycle, at least one life cycle for the update, has completed. Now, there was one final aspect of this update process that was really significant, but it wasn't a stage in itself, but rather it was something that actually affected every one of these different stages. And that was the influence of being part of an organization or being part of some management structure here. So administrators spoke about how being part of organization or having to report to management could affect their autonomy in terms of what decisions they could make, their policies and compliance requirements within the organizations that could dictate their behavior, the need to coordinate with other members of the organization, as well as just issues of resource and budget in terms of what can actually fund their operations. So ultimately, we saw that in many cases, the outcome of an update process was not strictly due to what administrators did, but often also due to these organizational factors that could be at play here. So at this point, here is kind of like the overview of what the update process looks like for administrators through our study. So where do we actually go from here? Well, I'm going to return back to that same image. Again, a lot of this actually looks quite similar to that of end users, but we found a lot of differences by looking at administrators in depth, and I think there's a lot of value in looking at this specialized population. Now, there's also some things that we can potentially do next for each of these different stages. So I didn't talk as much about the first stage, about learning about updates, but I did mention that administrators spoke about how information retrieval could be quite difficult. So as a community, we could work on ways to better centralize update information. And we could also look at ways to potentially do outreach campaigns to notify administrators about severe security problems or about important updates. And I've actually done some work in this space myself, so I'm happy to talk about that offline or afterwards. Now, to help administrators make decisions, we could also look at standardizing what information is available about updates to match the factors that administrators actually spoke about caring or weighing when they made these decisions. And oftentimes, this information was not available for all updates. And particularly related to what I mentioned earlier about prioritizing different types of updates, I think there's an interesting question of whether we can potentially split updates by types. And by this, I mean like splitting security updates from other types of updates. And some software vendors actually already do this, like Microsoft. But this isn't done as widely because it makes the development process rather difficult because you have like different updates or different releases. But potentially, we could look at different ways to still allow developers to effectively create software while splitting these updates apart. Then for the sake of time, I kind of clumped together these last three stages. And our study revealed that there were a lot of limitations and shortcomings of a lot of the update systems and tools that were used. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do in advancing both the technical but also the usability aspect of these tools. Just as an example, going back to the previous talk, a lot of people may be using GUI-driven tools these days. So what kind of information is actually being displayed in these tools? Is this the right kind of information to allow administrators to most effectively do their job? So I think there's a ton of work that can be done in this space. Finally, when it comes to these organizational management influences, I think we've really only scratched the surface in this study. This was actually something we had not initially anticipated when we set out to do the study. So I think there's a lot more work that can be done in more evaluating these organizational influences in more depth. Looking at perhaps what is the best synergy between organization and management and the particular administrators. So I think by pursuing some of these directions, which I've just put up all together here again, we can begin to really better understand how administrators behave and why they make the actions that they do, and we can try and better empower them in really fulfilling their role effectively as these so-called keepers of the machines. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions. Hello.
That was a really great talk. Thanks so much. I'm coming from industry into academia again after about a decade, and I spent a lot of my career in the role here, so I really appreciate looking into usability aspects there. Did you have any insight into the test suites that were in place or not in place for helping to automate the deployment between environments, like performance testing, load testing, other things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Connor. So we did try and understand this to some extent, like what kind of specific testing methods did they use, what kind of tools did they use. But this was not actually one of the like catered or focused questions, so we actually didn't get a very large response in that sense. So we heard a little bit about like people writing unit tests for certain types of things or kind of integration tests and such, but we didn't get a widespread sense of exactly, or a complete sense of what they actually did. And I think that's certainly something to look at much more in depth in the future. I really viewed this work as some initial exploration because in the literature there has been really limited work looking at, systematically looking at how administrators did this update process process. So I think there's a lot more work that can be done there.
One more?
Yep.
Do you have any future plans to look into the types of architectures and how updates are applied? For example, if someone's using immutable infrastructure and they have disposable containers they can throw away or disposable AMIs, it can be a very different approach to applying updates if the machine is very short-lived.
Yeah, so I think these are fantastic ideas. And in fact, one of the big limitations of our work is we didn't split up updates by even the types in general. So I think there's a lot finer granularity that we can look at, like what kind of platforms are they updating? Are they doing things in the cloud versus running their own hardware, which is very different. So I think there are a lot of different factors that can be kind of teased apart here, where in this initial study, we really didn't do that yet.
Cool. Thanks, Frank.
Yep.
Let's thank the speaker.
All right.